Technology evolves very, very quickly. People evolve very, very slowly. And I think we sometimes get lost in that mismatch. Okay, just because I can connect with you across town or across the world on a video conference, is that the best way to do it? It could be, but for certain kinds of work that involve us sharing and co-creating ideas and trying to understand each other so that we can then create something together, that's what hunter-gatherers did, and that's what we have to do. And they did them in tribes and communities in person. I argue you can get that same buzz and that same energy that feeds the creativity and the inspiration that you need for your job in places that are full of people who aren't necessarily your colleagues at the same company that you work for. And NextSpace was a great example of that early on.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Jeremy Neuner. Jeremy is the co-founder of NextSpace, which was one of the first co-working communities established in Santa Cruz, California. Jeremy is in a unique position to talk about one aspect of what people want from work, which is the space that they work in. Because Jeremy was in the business of selling space. At least that's what he started out to do. He quickly learned that people wanted a lot more than just a place to sit. At NextSpace, he learned how to give entrepreneurs, freelancers, creatives, that's a super diverse set of people, an environment that fostered community, real co-work, not just co-location. And they ended up opening sites across a lot of cities in the West and the Southwest of the United States, all very different locations, but somehow the members at different sites still saw each other as a single tribe. And I know, because I was a member. In this episode, Jeremy and I dive into the future of co-working spaces. We talk about the backstory and evolution of NextSpace, how language, rituals, and iconography can really tie together a community. We discuss the benefits of creating spaces that foster knowledge and innovation economies in a town or a region. And we touch on the mistakes that facilities planners make when they think their job is about buildings instead of being about humans. We discuss the current state of workplaces post-COVID and where we go from here, along with a lot of other topics. So if you enjoy this episode, and I certainly hope you do, please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Jeremy Neuner. Jeremy Neuner, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks, Dart. I really appreciate you having me.
You have had an experience that I think is super important to this podcast, which is we're talking all about the experience of work. And frequently, when people think of the experience of work, they think about the space that work happens in. And I think when you look around at work, one of the more designed things is actually the space because it's designed by architects and things like that. It's frequently crappy and sometimes it's good. But your experience is that you founded one of the first co-working spaces that I know of in Santa Cruz, California, which is NextSpace. And what that means is that you've been in the business of selling a place to work. It's like this purified, like nobody was there who didn't want to be there because of where it was.
You had to actually pay money.
And pay money, right? And pay money to be there. I would love to talk to you about what you learned from that, about what people want from that kind of space.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. We started the company back in 2008 called NextSpace in the early days of the co-working movement, revolution, however you want to refer to it. We started out thinking about it very much from a space perspective, right? As you said, that's the easiest thing to gravitate towards. And space, generally speaking, matters a lot to people in their lives, right? We care about our homes and, gosh, I wish I could remodel that kitchen. You know, when we go into public buildings, I grew up in Washington, D.C., so there were buildings and there were monuments, and anybody who's been into an amazingly architected space, there's something about it that's sort of magical. We've always had this, right? I mean, we've built pyramids and Parthenons and temples, and we've always cared about space and structure as a culture and as a species. So, of course, we started thinking about space. How much space? What kind of space? And that was just because it's where our brains kind of naturally go. We learned that space is important because it needs to be functional, it needs to be comfortable, it needs to be not too hot and not too cold. It needs to, have a place for you to put your butt and put your laptop and put your cup of coffee. So space matters, but it wasn't the most important thing. We learned pretty quickly. People came to NextSpace, especially our first location in downtown Santa Cruz, and they'd come to the top of the stairs. We were on the second floor, and they'd look around, and the space was actually pretty cool. It had been architected originally for sort of a, late 90s, early 2000s software company when, those kinds of companies were first thinking about what kind of space do we want for our employees and things like that. So the architecture was actually pretty cool. And they'd come up and they'd say, hey, how much can we rent an office for or rent a desk or whatever? And we quickly learned that we would turn that question around and we'd say, hey, well, thanks for coming up. We don't actually rent you anything here at NextSpace. We sell you membership in a community. And that simple turning of what we thought we were selling and what we were trying to convince our customers and our members that we were selling wasn't space, it was community. I forget if that was accidental or whether we had some sort of early highfalutin ideas or what, but for a whole bunch of people, that was really compelling. Oh, what do you mean? And they wanted to learn more. A few people would turn around and say, yeah, whatever. I just want to rent an office. I'll see you later. But this idea of community is what we really tried to sell and what we really tried to deliver on that brand promise. I think that's probably the biggest thing that we learned is that the customers that we were serving, and this is back in 2008, and we can somewhere in the conversation today, I hope we sort of fast forward a little bit to today, but people really wanted community.
Yeah, it's interesting because I worked at NextSpace and I was at the time working for a large corporation, but I would come there to work. And it was a space, but first of all, it was a space where the space seemed to express community. And what the expression of that community was, first of all, by the way, I worked in that space before it was NextSpace because the startup that was there before you were there was bought by my company. And so it became a space that I could work in. And it was, the structure of the space mattered. It was a nice space. It was one of the buildings that almost fell down in the earthquake. And so it had all these girders inside it to hold it up and it had this kind of organic feeling. But it didn't have the personality of NextSpace. NextSpace, for instance, had a sense of humor. And it didn't have that sense of humor beforehand. And it was also full of people I didn't know. When you built that community, if it wasn't the space, what was it made out of?
Great question. It was made out of people. And I know that sounds trite, but we often forget that the most amazing architecture in the world, beautiful, soaring, quaint, whatever it is the architect's going for, you're building it for humans. Very seldom do we build an amazing building and say, no one's allowed in. We built it just for the purpose of the architecture. That's art, and that's fine, but that's not why we build buildings. We build them for people. And we would give people permission to express themselves in the community, but also within the space. We knew pretty quickly that we were running this idea. We had this idea of that we're selling community and not space. And we would make people read over and sign a set of community norms. Hey, we're all going to share this space together. And before we got into the details of do your dishes, don't talk too loud when you're sitting next to somebody else, there was some sort of kind of practical, mechanical community norms. But the very first thing we had at the top of that list was the following statement, and I think I can still say it verbatim all these years later. NextSpace is a community. We and your fellow members expect and require you to both give and get something from this community. And right off the bat, even if you didn't know exactly what we were talking about, there was an expectation and a requirement about being part of this community. There were things you had to do. We expect and require you to both give and get something from the community. And people in the early days were able to feel like they had permission and even an obligation to sort of make the space their own, which I don't think you always get when your company says, here's your building, here's your floor, here's your cube, here's your desk. One of my favorite stories from those early days is it wasn't immediately obvious where the bathrooms were, right? This is a not an important thing to know when a group of people get together. Where's the bathroom? So one of our early members, his name was Aaron Rhodes. Aaron liked to fancy himself as a pirate. He would sometimes come to NextSpace dressed in full pirate regalia. And he said, look, I have an extra pirate flag. Can I put it up where the bathrooms are so that all you have to do is say, when someone says, where's the bathroom, you just point to the pirate flag. It's right over there by the pirate flag. I'm like, sounded as good an idea as any, right? So we put the pirate flag and Aaron put it up for us. And sure enough, it was not only a wonderful sort of practical reason to put it up there. People now knew where the bathrooms were, and it was an easy way for us to tell them. But also just a way for us to kind of express a little bit, or at least that this one person to express his idea of this space in this community, and also to invite other people, maybe not so directly, but to invite other people to not only embrace the pirate flag, but what could I add to this space in this community where I get to express something about me and my personality. And when that happens, and that happens enough, and people feel that feeling of ownership and expectation of ownership, all the little pieces start to kind of, smorgasbord together into what was the NextSpace community.
Where did the giant robot come from with the cigar?
That for those who don't know, if you remember, I forget what show it was.
Futurama,
where Bender the
I
robot.
think.
Yeah, Futurama, right? And Bender the robot was a character, and another one of our members, one of our very early members, and Chris Miller, if you're out there, I love you to death, man. Chris again had a very practical problem to solve. He was a tinkerer, he was a maker, and had made these Futurama robot costumes. And I think he started out with like a big 55-gallon barrel or something like that. I mean, this was not a small, simple costume. And he had no place to store it in his house. He said, can I bring it here and just put it up there? And I said, yeah, sure. That's kind of how it happened. And again, someone was trying to solve a practical problem. I got no place to store last year's Halloween costume. That's this giant robot. And it was pretty cool. I mean, he had put little servos in to make the eyes move and a little LED on the end of the cigar that would light up. And that sort of embodied, in some ways, kind of the ethos of a lot of people in the NextSpace community. These were entrepreneurs. These were independent consultants. These were folks who were trying to make a living and make a life in different ways than sort of the 9-to-5 corporate world. And so that kind of tinkerer maker, we didn't really realize, we didn't think through this at the time. We said, sure, Chris, you can store your robot here. But we kind of realized that robot kind of started to not only looked cool, but kind of represented some of the ethos of the people that we were trying to attract.
Yeah, that was something that was very common across the entire community. The sense of hustle. Now, everybody was hustling in a different way. One person had an S&M website that they were working on. One person was working on beneficial pheromones that are going to attract predators that prey on bad insects. Everybody was hustling, but there was a sense of hustle.
Everybody had something going on, yeah.
And you mentioned prior to this call that there were a few things that sort of held the space together.
Yeah, and this was something that we only reverse engineered later, that were a series of happy accidents, one of which was the pirate flag over the bathroom. We started doing Friday happy hours, just sort of a chance for everybody on Friday afternoon to kind of just get together and chat and hang out. They weren't always, although sometimes, sort of super boozy affairs. They were just a chance for folks to kind of get together. And I would put out an email, usually, Thursday or maybe first thing Friday morning, say, hey, happy hour is on Friday. And people would say, what time? And I go, I don't know, it's at 3:58. It literally was just something stupid and quirky. Like, let's not do 4 o'clock, let's do 3:58. So those little things started to create this, and here are the three words, that I think hold most kind of cultures and communities together: language, ritual, and iconography. Language, ritual, and iconography, symbols. And as we started thinking about expanding from one location to two and then eventually nine, we wanted to figure out what was the language, ritual, and iconography that made the first space work and could be replicated. So, sure enough, every NextSpace, whether it was in San Francisco or LA or Santa Cruz or Chicago, they all had a pirate flag to mark the bathrooms. Every NextSpace happy hour started at 3:58 on Friday, no matter where you were. Although, funny story, one of the locations in LA, which kind of baffles me because you think LA is sort of more laid back than San Francisco, insisted that 3:58 was too early, and by gosh, they were going to start their happy hour at 4:58. All right, fine. But at least it was 4:58, not 5 o'clock. Everybody at NextSpace, we called each other spacers, right? That was sort of the unofficial term. Sometimes people would, when they posted an email to the community list, they go, "Hey, spacers." And so you start to see this language around community and giving and getting and calling each other spacers. That's the language. The ritual around things like, happy hour at 3:58 and not 4 o'clock on a Friday. The iconography of pirate flags over bathrooms. We also had our unofficial mascot was Sir Reginald Moose, and he was an orange moose head. Imagine like a plaster orange moose. There's a long story about why an orange moose became our mascot, but every NextSpace had an orange moose. So the idea was that there was a sense of sort of immediate comfort and community. If you think about hunter-gatherers from, 100,000 years ago, they needed a quick way to identify friend or foe. And if we share language, ritual, and iconography, that's a very easy way for you to establish your bona fides to me and vice versa, that you're friendly. And even from neighboring tribes, the same thing would happen. So that when someone from a NextSpace in San Francisco went down to a NextSpace in Los Angeles, because some sort of reciprocity of membership was part of the business model, they could walk into a NextSpace and see the orange moose and see the pirate flag, and someone would say, "Hey, spacer." And they knew, even though they didn't know a soul, they'd never been to the building, didn't know a soul, there was some sense that I'm amongst my people, right? I'm not going to, fall in love with you and start a business with you and be your best bro immediately, but there is a sense that, okay, there's a certain amount of positive expectation around the people that I've just walked in amongst, and they have the same kind of positive expectation of me. And that just was enough to break down barriers among people very quickly to make happen what we hoped would happen. And what did happen is that they get to know each other. They would, at the very least, know somebody cool and interesting, new that they didn't know before. Oftentimes, a "hey, how are you" introductory conversation would last like an hour when someone discovered that I was the chocolate to their peanut butter or vice versa, that they were working on something similar or complementary. And sometimes it could take a long time, days, weeks, years, for two people who know each other to get into that sort of conversation. It could happen within minutes at NextSpace because we were able to identify each other as friend versus foe. And if not friend, then at least someone who I had some kind of connection or bona fide relationship between.
I would actually argue that some of the language, ritual, and iconography acted as a filter, a selection device, which is there are certain people who are going to walk up and say, "Duh, giant robot, I'm looking for a place that looks like a law office," and would walk back out.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, people would walk in and say, "Hey, how much can I rent one of your offices for?" And I would say, "Hey, you can't rent an office, but you could buy a membership." That alone was sometimes a filter, right? Before we even got into NextSpace and community and language, ritual, and iconography. And certainly there were people who did that. Most people were at least intrigued. Tell me more. And so the sales pitch was never really a hard sales pitch. I got somebody else looking at this baby right now, and you better take it before they do. they were curious about what was happening inside of the space. This sort of perfectly fine, but not utterly gorgeous, amazing. I mean, it was really nice space, the first one, but it wasn't Class A New York City or San Francisco Financial District office space. But they were curious about what was happening here because of the robot, because of the pirate flag, because of how we were talking to them. And at the very least, they wanted to learn more. And often than not, they were like, okay, this is kind of cool. I'd like to be part of this. And sometimes they'd be like, you know what, you all are a bunch of weirdos.
Right. Which, it's Santa Cruz. And so it was a very Santa Cruz crowd. Santa Cruz is a town that has a lot of, it has pirates, people who dress as pirates occasionally. And so it's like a good example.
Does indeed.
I remember also, and this is actually a part of the physical space, is that it had the cafe area in the middle, and you could have a cafe membership, which is what I had. And the cafe membership meant was that I didn't have walls, but I could sit at a table with a bunch of other people. And that gave it this sort of public, there was a chance to meet a stranger. You're going to meet somebody and you're going to talk to them and you've never seen them before. It was way better than sitting at home, partially because of that. The happy hour too.
Yeah, everything that I want to tell you about what you just said, I wish I could say that we had thought about this, that we were smart enough to have thought about this ahead of time. We were not. We were at least smart enough to realize what we were doing and kind of reverse engineer it. But this idea of the cafe, first of all, to be clear, we weren't running an actual cafe, but we called it that because one of my co-founders, Ryan, and I kind of thought this might be a good idea while sitting in a coffee shop in Santa Cruz and looking around and seeing that there was a lot of people who had been there for a long time and were on their laptops. We said to ourselves, well, they can't all be just spending all this time checking their Facebook feeds for the last 90 minutes. Maybe a few of them were, but they were probably doing something, and they were doing exactly what you just said. I don't want to be at home. And this is how when I first came to Santa Cruz, I was still telecommuting back to a job in Washington, D.C., and I didn't want to sit at home. So I went to the Ugly Mug Cafe in SoCal because that was close to my house at the time. And I'd sit there for a couple hours and I would work. And so that's exactly what everybody else was doing. So this idea of a cafe membership came from that. And we thought that idea would, that name, that brand would resonate with folks. The thing that was, again, sort of one of these happy accidents is that the kitchen space in this first building that we occupied in Santa Cruz was very much front and center. Whereas if you think of like the typical kind of, corporate break room, it's sort of tucked in the back. Nobody sees it. But one of my favorite little aphorisms is that sooner or later, every party ends up in the kitchen. Think about the fun parties you've been to. Eventually, everybody ends up in the kitchen. And so why not just make the kitchen the party?
You had mentioned that when it comes to language, ritual, and iconography, it's something that the military does well. I would love to hear examples from that.
Yeah, the military certainly does it, but so do lots of other professions. I happen to have spent the first 9 years of my professional career in the United States Navy. And we have a language all of our own. And some of them are slang terms from the days of yore, and some of them are just specific to the jobs that we're doing, and it's very technical. Ritual, certainly, militaries have tons of ritual around how we do things and why we do things. And then goodness, iconography, uniforms and medals and rank insignia. Like I can walk up to somebody who's in a military uniform and know a lot about them without knowing their name, without knowing who they are. I know what branch of service that they're in. I know what rank they are. I might even know what job they have or what sort of job family they're from by taking 2 seconds to look at their uniform. And again, that is where a lot of the community and the camaraderie of being in the military comes from, is that we have a sense of who each other is, and we have a sense of why they're there and what they're good at and where they fit in the pecking order. But my wife, as you know, she's a physician, and they have a lot of the same things, right? What kind of coat you're wearing, whether you have a stethoscope around your neck, what kind of language you're using. It's a very easy way to be able to say, okay, you're a doctor, you're a nurse, you're a medical assistant. Not so much from a rank perspective, but because they have to know who's who pretty fast. especially when, there's some sort of like, fast moving case or trauma or whatever. I don't have time to say, oh, are you the doctor? Are you the nurse? Are you the medical assistant? Are you the what? I got to know. And same thing for the military too. So there's a way for us to kind of identify and smoothly move into what our role is and have an expectation of what others' roles are. And so, again, I wish could tell you that I was smart enough to say I'd learned all these things about language, ritual, and iconography in the military, and I so wisely brought them into my startup. Maybe subconsciously I did, but again, a lot of this was sort of reverse engineered after we started thinking about replicating our spaces in the company. But this idea of using language, ritual, and iconography to sort of identify one another and sort of create that cohesion amongst each other, it happens all over professions. It happens all over cultures, uniforms, symbols, clothing, amulets, speech, how we speak. My in-laws are British, and they can tell a lot about somebody about what their accent is. They have to open their mouth for 5 seconds, and you can sort of begin to make some assumptions about that person and where they're from and what they're like and how they think.
So after NextSpace, you went to Google. What did you learn? Because it's a different set of language and ritual and iconography, and lots of things were different. So what was the lesson?
Oh boy, what was the lesson? First of all, just for me personally, going from being the CEO of a 30-person company to a little tiny cog in a 100,000-person company was an adjustment, learning how to do that. There were certainly lessons there. But I did work on the real estate team there. And what was amazing to me was not terribly dissimilar what we were trying to do with NextSpace. How do you take this idea? Everybody remembers the original Googleplex in the early 2000s, and it was on the cover of magazines, and this is the new way to work because there were slides and free food and candy and like all this stuff and like, stuff that had never been done before. And then how do you kind of replicate that? Same thing we were thinking about. How do we replicate the look and the feel and the community of NextSpace across locations? And Google has done it at massive, massive scale across cultures and geographies and languages. And one of the cool things is that you can walk into a Google building anywhere in the world and kind of know you're in a Google building. Not just because there's the big giant sign Google there, but there's some things there that they've been able to kind of replicate at scale. And that's really impressive, really impressive.
It's hard to replicate quirkiness at scale and retain authenticity.
You led me into this perfectly. When you replicate something at scale, you have to get good at the machinery behind cranking this stuff out. And that original quirkiness was something that we definitely tried to replicate, and honestly with some success. But that original quirkiness that was a lot driven by the early employees at Google, from what I understand of the lore, that's hard to replicate. And I showed up at the real estate team at Google at what I saw as sort of an interesting time. We had been really good at cranking out amazing, beautiful, fun, colorful, amenity-rich spaces at scale. But again, as I said at the beginning, we sometimes forget that we're doing all this for the sake of the humans in the building or the humans in this little teeny part of the building. And what I discovered is that a lot of the humans at Google, while they were very grateful for, or often grateful for, the beauty and the fun and the whimsy and the perks of a Google building, they weren't working for them. That how they were working now, and whether you were a software engineer, or you were, an HR analyst, or you were a salesperson, or whatever, all these different kinds of people were all starting to work very differently. My analogy was we'd gotten really good at cranking out Budweiser, and people started wanting craft beer. That was my analogy. There is a sort of sameness, but people started realizing that what we were building wasn't always working for them. And the machinery wasn't able to turn on a dime, because giant machines can't, to then be able to start to customize for the software engineer, for the HR analyst, for the salesperson, for whoever. And so that's when I first started to notice that it's hard to scale and replicate quirkiness. It's hard to scale and replicate personality. And again, I'm not trying to cast shade on Google here. I just think that it's a hard thing to do. And I think it took a long time to sort of recognize that not everything that we make works for the people that we're trying to make it for, even if our intentions are really good.
One of the things I thought Google did really well in the New York building in Chelsea was that it provided a whole lot of variation in space so that you could just migrate to the kind of space that you wanted to be in. I liked that a lot. And there was this one wall that was all honeycomb. You could climb up this thing and you could get into a honeycomb and you could sit in it. And I looked at that and I was like, that's like a theory, right? And then I was walking there and there were two people up in the honeycomb. And it's like, that's where they wanted to be that day. And you could find anything in that building that was whatever space you needed.
Yeah. And I think that is more akin to kind of who we are and how we're working now, right? I often have to switch modes. And more jobs require more switching more often than other jobs do. A software engineer who's cranking on code could probably sit at his or her desk for long stretches of time in front of their computer and not ever have to switch modes. But in sort of a knowledge innovation economy that we're sort of in, I might have to switch modes quickly from I need to focus because I've got something I got to crank out. Now I need to connect. And maybe I'm connecting for work reasons. Maybe I'm connecting for social reasons, but I need space to connect. I need space to learn. And I need space to collaborate. And I might need those four different, or there's probably different modes that I'm not naming. I need those 4 or 5 modes, maybe 4 or 5 different times in the course of an average day, or certainly in the course of an average week or month. And so this idea of flexibility and choice and letting the employees not only have the sort of freedom, the spoken freedom about exercising that flexibility and choice. It's okay if the boss doesn't see me at my desk because the boss knows that maybe I'm someplace else in a different kind of work mode. That's sort of psychological safety and that sort of those cultural cues that not being at my desk doesn't mean I'm not working, but also just the physical environment. Again, are there places where I can do all those things? That's hard to do because what if everybody needs to connect and collaborate at the exact same time? Or what if no one needs to connect and collaborate and I've got, all this unused square footage? I mean, there's a dollars and cents perspective to this too. Real estate's expensive stuff. It's usually the second most expensive thing on the company's expense sheet after people. So yes, I want to give people infinite flexibility and choice, but man, to really do that is super, super expensive. So what's the trade-off? And I think those are the kinds of things that corporate real estate people are trying to grapple with. One of my first managers at Google told me something really smart. He said, you build things with sticks and bricks very differently than you build things with bits and bytes. And I think the bits and bytes people sometimes expect the sticks and bricks people to be able to change things around as quickly as they can. I don't like how the software that I'm writing is presenting itself on the screen, couple of quick lines of code change, and now it's different. You can't do that with buildings. But the way I think you can do that a little faster and a little easier is this idea of sort of culture and what sort of permissible and accepted and expected. That allows me to change much faster than I just can't move this wall or turn this building inside out. But I can think about how I'm allowed and what permissions I have and sort of cultural norms and expectations I have about how I'm supposed to use the space.
It's interesting. There's a book, The Secret Life of Buildings, that talks about pace layers. And the pace layers are the location of the building never changes. The walls of the building change very rarely. The exterior walls change very rarely. The interior walls change a little bit more often. The furniture change more often than that. The people change more often than that. But this idea that you have a cultural component of it is something that you could potentially adapt more quickly, especially because it's self-adapting. It can self-generate. It's going to self-generate. You can't necessarily make it generate.
Exactly. And so what level of sort of invitation and permission do I have to be able to self-generate and self-adapt the culture, or collectively generate and adapt the culture. I think that's a really important key in this whole work for humans thing, is what level of agency and autonomy do folks have, certainly over their work, but also how they do their work and where they do their work and who they do their work with. And look, we're smack dab in the middle of a early post-pandemic where people are like, yeah, how about I don't return to the office? Thanks very much. And because I said so is going to be a very problematic reason that employers are going to give their employees to come back to work. It's got to be something. I mean, they certainly could use because I said so. I just think that's not going to be a very convincing or compelling or effective argument. Instead, where is my, again, autonomy, choice, flexibility?
For a growing company, you have to be predicting what the size of the company is going to be 5 years out. Well, any company, right? You have to be predicting what it's going to be 5 years out because you need to start building now to have the space ready for when that actually happens. And I'd like to talk about the state of workplaces right now, because I think this gets into like what's going on right now. One of the things is we thought more people were going to come back to work than did. And there's a critical mass that needs to be achieved in buildings or they feel empty. And if they feel empty, the buzz isn't there. Like the community you were talking about that NextSpace had, NextSpace was crowded. I mean, it was kind of packed with people. There were a lot of people there.
Yeah, a lot of people there, for sure.
And a lot of hustle, right? And there was this feeling of people and hustle, and that's what people came for to some extent. I almost feel like we're going to have to cram people together more to create the fusion state that we need to create critical mass. And then over time, we'll fill up all the buildings. But what's the state today of our transition back to these spaces?
I can use myself as I think, semi-representative example. I'm a people person. I thrive on that fusion state, not just for my personality, but I think I actually do my job better. I'm a manager. I'm supposed to be thinking about cross-functional partnerships and things like that. And to me, I do that work better when I'm with people, physically with them. I can have the conversations over a video call or something like that, and that's fine. But I'll just take a slight detour into another one of my favorite aphorisms, is that technology evolves very, very quickly. People evolve very, very slowly. And we have not appreciably evolved as a species much biologically in the last 100,000 years. And of course, our technology just in the last 50 years has evolved amazingly. And I think we sometimes get lost in that mismatch. Okay, just because I can connect with you across town or across the world on a video conference, is that the best way to do it? It could be. But for certain kinds of work that involve us sharing and co-creating ideas and trying to understand each other so that we can then create something together, that's what hunter-gatherers did, and that's what we have to do. And they did them in tribes and communities in person. So that's why I kind of like and seek out that buzz. I also, and this is my choice, live about 45 minutes away from where I work, and there's a lot of traffic between here and there. And it's a big pain in the butt logistically. And you and I, Dart, live and work in the San Francisco Bay Area, and lots of people do. And any sort of big metro area across the country or across the world has the same thing, right? And we can argue in another podcast about whether the suburban and ex-urbanization of the country is a good or a bad idea, but bottom line, it's where we're at, right? So there are days when the 45-minute commute is an important and worthwhile cost to be able to get the benefit of in-person connection and collaboration. And there are days when the 45-minute commute is not worth the cost because I've got to do something else, right? I've got to be focused on creating this presentation or this strategy doc for my boss or whatever. Well, I'm not going to drive 45 minutes to sit in a room by myself in an office to crank that out. I'll just do it here. So again, just like we were saying before, that there was a lot of flexibility and choice inside the Google office in New York City, that flexibility and choice has to be expanded out into the great wide world. The other thing that I think is a potential state change that we're seeing is that in order to get that buzz to feel inspired, connected, creative, do I need to be in a building full of the same people that get their paychecks signed by the same people as I do? Or can I do it someplace else where I just happen to be surrounded by other creative people who are in that kind of buzz and that energy? I argue, and we saw some early examples of this way back in the early days of NextSpace, that you can get that same buzz and that same energy that feeds the creativity and the inspiration that you need for your job in places that are full of people who aren't necessarily your colleagues at the same company that you work for. And NextSpace was a great example of that early on.
I'd say even more so. I was more supercharged by the people at NextSpace than I was at the people in my giant corporate office. And that's because, again, it's that hustle thing, but it was also the radical diversity of businesses they were in that I could learn from.
Yeah. And so there's this at one point in my life I fancied myself a self-appointed expert in social capital theory. I was never an expert in social capital theory, but I learned a couple of interesting things. And this idea of bonding versus bridging social capital. Bonding social capital is amongst people who are like you, right? It provides you a sense of connection and community and safety. That's bonding social capital. Bridging social capital is for people who aren't like you, who are maybe not terribly different, but just different enough that you can learn something from them and they can learn something from you. And I'm not a social capital expert, but I'll quote one right now, a guy named Javier de Souza Briggs, who was a professor at Harvard for a while. I'm not sure where he is now. But he has a great phrase. Bonding social capital is for getting by. Bridging social capital is for getting ahead. And that if you want to really innovate and connect and collaborate, you have to bridge to someone else. Someone else is going to enhance your idea, test your idea, add on to it, totally rip it down completely, whatever it is. You need different perspective. You need different people. There was a great early example of this at NextSpace that proves the point that I think I'm trying to make now. The one big technology company in Santa Cruz at the time was called Plantronics. They're now called Poly. They've merged with Polycom a few years ago. And a couple of their engineers were working on, it was an audio mixer, because I guess hardcore gamers needed to be able to mix their music with their game audio and with their phone. They needed to be able to dial that in depending on what was happening. And so they created this little audio mixer, and they wanted to get some feedback on it. So they called us up and they said, could we come over and hang out for a little bit? I was like, yeah, sure. And because they saw people at NextSpace happen to be some of their target market and their target demographic for who might use this little audio mixer. So they just sort of hung out for a couple hours and pulled people over. Hey, are you a gamer? Yeah. Okay, can I talk to you for a sec? And they probably got $1 bazillion worth of user experience research and product and market research in that 2 hours of informal chatting to some of the NextSpace members. And they kind of realized it. They said, hey, we'd actually like to pay you guys a membership so we can hang out and do this more often. We're like, yeah, sold. So that same kind of thing, obviously there's intellectual property and corporate secret issues that every company would have to kind of navigate. But just being around people who you can do that bridging social capital with, I think, is what would be kind of the next wave. So instead of all of us going to work in the big corporate campus that happens to be some number of minutes or miles or hours away from where we live, why can't we all just be where we live and all mix together and see what happens? And if I work for big company X and you work for small company Y and somebody over there works for medium company Z, who cares? We're going to be in that mix and that energy, and that's going to make us better, especially in an innovation and a knowledge economy.
Yeah, I love the idea of bridging social capital. I'm totally going to study that. First of all, this podcast is for bridging social capital. That's what it's about. I get to talk to people who are from completely different walks of life, from completely different places about the experience of work. And I'm learning a ton from that and breaking through into whole new organizations, whole new groups of people around the world. It's just fantastic. But I noticed that universities do this really well, which is, for instance, they have a sabbatical system where every 5 or 7 years, you can go work at a different university for 6 months or a year. And so you can connect with all of these different voices, and they have seminar series where people are coming through and giving lectures. They tend to not do it cross-departmentally, which is a problem. But they're still great at bridging social capital.
And this is not a new idea. Back in the 1950s, Bell Labs was designed exactly that way. We have some of the smartest PhD scientists on the planet. Let's just sort of stick them together and see what happens. And a bunch of really cool things happened.
I think the military does this too, which is, why is it that people who work for the military are constantly moving all over the world? Is it because the needs are changing that much in different parts of the world? No. It's because I assume, you can tell me if this is true, we're one military. We're not a bunch of regional militaries. And we need to have that bridging social capital to really function. Is that self-conscious in the military?
I think it has been much more so. I mean, it's been a little while since I've been in the military, but when I was there, the word joint was something that was really, and joint meant not just the Army or just the Navy or just the Air Force. It was all these different services being combined in a joint way. And if you wanted to rise in the ranks, you had to have a certain amount of joint experience. And if you didn't have that, there's only so far where you'd get promoted up the ranks. It's also why when you go to the Naval War College, you'll see just as many Army and Air Force officers as you will naval officers, as you will in the Air Force Command and Staff College and the Army General Staff College. We've realized as a military that we need this cross-pollination because it makes you more effective when it comes time to do that kind of stuff. So it's very front and center, and I think they do it more and more now than they probably did in the past. Funny story that I might be apocryphal, but Steve Jobs, when he was starting Pixar, whatever he did after Apple, purposely put the bathrooms, here we go on bathrooms again, far away. So people would have to travel and mix and mingle to and from the bathroom. And that was his secret little trick to get people out of their cubes, out of their offices, and getting to mix. Because again, a business like that requires collaboration, it requires connection, it requires riffing on ideas and things like that. And you can't do that by yourself.
At Zappos in Las Vegas, they bought a big city building. I can't remember what it was, but it was some building that had some other purpose. They deliberately made it so that you could only get in through the front door. And the idea was that as you came through the front door, you would reach a compression point where you would meet people who you might not otherwise meet once you sat down at your desk. I think we're going to have to completely change a lot of the way we work. And I think one of the things is that we're going to have to create fusion events where we bring people together and compress them for a week and then let them scatter again.
Yeah. You were just talking about architectural tricks, right? Everybody's got to go through the same front door. Everybody's got to travel to get to the bathroom, right? Those are interesting little architectural tricks. What if we actually stopped tricking people and started saying that this sort of connection and collaboration is, as I told you a few minutes ago, at the very top of our NextSpace community norms? You are expected and required to give and get something from this community. In the military, you are expected and required to get some joint experience, or you will not advance very far in the ranks. At this company, whatever company it is, you are expected and required to both give and get from people in adjacent or perhaps far-flung departments and disciplines. And by the way, we have an obligation as your employer, if we create an expectation and a requirement, to help you fulfill that expectation and requirement. So we might do it because we're going to make the bathrooms far away and everybody's got to go do it. We might do it a little bit more overtly on here's how the culture is going to work. Here are the ways that we are going to get together. I love this idea of sort of compression events. Fine, work from home. no problem. But once a month, once a week, once a quarter, whatever it is, we're going to slam you all together for a period of time and create some norms about what happens when we do that. That's the exact analog of everybody having to shove their way through the front door. We no longer have the luxury to sort of do this accidentally and to sort of trick people into doing it. We need to do it very intentionally and get people to be part of that process rather than sort of mandating it on top of them.
See, here's an example of what we could do. We can start brainstorming the future of this. I once had an offsite. I used to facilitate large, complex meetings a lot, and we had one of these large, complex meetings on an island in a lake in Montana. There is an island in a lake in Montana that has a building. We stuffed people in there. You couldn't get off the island unless you wanted to take a boat, and it was one of the best meetings ever. But it seems to me that we could have the equivalent of a Silomar. For people who are listening internationally, that's a conference center in Monterey. And we could have the equivalent of that big companies actually own. We could have something in Puget Sound or something where this is the compression point, which is going to be fairly low cost because we're going to be using it 100% of the time. We're going to be compressing people into this space. One of the challenges, by the way, with NextSpace for me when I was working for a corporation is IP, which is I could not be private enough in a community space that was not controlled by my company, and the IP risk was too high. But you could potentially have scattered sites that were still corporate property. Let's do that.
Salesforce, giant, big enterprise cloud-based software company, has headquartered up in San Francisco and offices all over the world. They have recently taken over a place that's called 1440 University, that is just up the road for where you and I live, Dart. And they have done it, and it's a sort of a residential, retreat kind of center tucked up into the redwood forest of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And that's exactly what they're using it for. We are going to get people in and to compress them. And what they do and how they do it and all that sort of stuff, I don't know, but I do know they're being very intentional about creating a retreat space, but they're really not thinking of it as sort of retreat space. A retreat is where like senior leaders in a company go to, spend time together and think big thoughts and plot the future. This is like, no, we're going to go and we're going to get stuff done. And it might be very senior people, very junior people, a mix of all of them together. But this is where we're going to do this sort of compression exercise that you talked about. And we're going to use it all the time. We're just going to run 500 people at a time for a week through this place. And it's not going to sit empty. It's going to be very highly used real estate. And off they're going to go. And hopefully those compression moments, and then you do it for a week. And as you said, you scatter back and you're revitalized and energized. Your head's full of big ideas. And now you're going to go implement on them and execute. And then you're going to come back some number of weeks or months later and do it all over again. Very smart.
There was a site that I visited. It was a secret innovation space called Factory in San Francisco. It was on Alamo Square. And it had such a generic name that you couldn't even find it by searching online. And what they'd done is they'd taken the largest private residence in San Francisco, which was once owned by the Bishop of San Francisco in 1907 or something like that. And they had bought it. The middle floor was a meeting space, and every single wall was a whiteboard in this whole mansion on the first floor. The upper stories were residences. They were places that you could go and sleep. It had a kitchen in the middle floor too, in the ground floor. And then the basement was a makerspace. And what they would do is they would hold these innovation sessions where they would bring in, okay, here are the designers, here's the engineers, here's, like, imagine you were they were designing a new heart, a new artificial heart. They would bring in nurses, they would bring in cardiac surgeons, they would bring in designers, every single person who might be involved in that particular product. They would meet all day, and then they would send the ideas down to the makerspace, and the makerspace would come up in the morning bleary-eyed and say, how about this artificial heart? And they'd say, yeah, but, and they'd test it out and try it. And so it wasn't just a space for ideas. It was vertically integrated innovation space.
It's very cool.
Super interesting. Went out of business. But it went out of business in part because it was a secret. I'm going to switch topics. I asked this of everybody towards the end of the interview, which is, what do you hire your job to do for you?
I think I've hired my job for different reasons over the years. I hire my current job to give me a stage to play on. And I guess here's what I mean by that. I'm certainly not a trained professional actor, but I do like to connect with people, to share my ideas with people. And this is definitely like a small, intimate stage, in a smoke-filled room or whatever, where you're close to the audience and they get to interact with you. Whether you want them to or not, they're going to interact with you. And that kind of give and take, and that happens, practically speaking, where I get to present something and then the next question I ask is, what do you all think? And I will very clearly say, is Jeremy a genius or is Jeremy an idiot? Let me know, and be very, very provocative in that invitation. You hear about jazz musicians in the 20s, playing on the little speakeasy or whatever, and they would play the same songs every night, but play them very differently depending on who was in the audience that night and what their energy was and what they were giving back. So that's the kind of stage I try to hire my job for. A lot of us do the same thing every day in our jobs, but I'm going to do it differently depending on what that audience is giving back to me.
I love that. It's not a stage with 1,000 people. It's a smoky, intimate stage where you're playing a duet with your audience.
I'd never thought of it quite like that, but I think that's a genius way of putting it.
What else do you hire your job to do for you?
Lately, again, in my slightly older, perhaps slightly wiser years, I hire my job to give me people to help grow and mentor and develop. I enjoy that. I think I'm pretty good at it. And I certainly want to pay forward the growth and the mentorship and development that I received when I was younger in my career. I hire my job to give me people to give a shit about, because I think there's a shortage of those sorts of folks in the world, especially in the corporate world. And so how can I make sure that I hire a job where I get people to, I don't want to say take care of, because that sounds a little too paternalistic, but people that I can care about and that I can help develop, who I can jointly, again, this duet, right? I mean, leadership and management is a duet between the leaders and the people being led. What do I see in you that I can help bring out? What do I not see in you that you see in you that you'd like help being brought out? And trying to find the ways to do that. Again, we sometimes forget in all of this gee whiz bang technology world that we live in, we expect a lot from our technology. We expect it to be intuitive. We expect it to know our names and our preferences and our likes and our dislikes. And it takes work and effort to get that out of other people. To hire a job that lets me do that, and just remember that we're all a group of wonderful, amazing, complex, messy, emotional, problematic, awesome human beings. I want to hire a job that lets me hang out with those folks and they want to hang out with me.
So if I'm a company and I am a supply chain of those kinds of people to you, and by the way, some faculty have said exactly the same thing to me. They've said, I hire my university to deliver the kind of students that are going to thrive with me, is sort of the way they talk about it. How is your company doing at delivering at the supply chain of people you can give a shit about?
I think they do pretty well, actually. I heard a wonderful, again, this Jeremy's full of aphorisms today, that big technology companies often hire insecure type A's, which is very, very interesting sort of juxtaposition, People are certainly smart and ambitious, but are uncertain about their smarts and ambition. And I think if I'm being my job is delivering me insecure type A's, I think they do a pretty good job of it. And what can I do to make them a little more secure so that they have more confidence and can be more at ease with being who they are and what their gifts are and what their talents are, because they certainly have those gifts and talents, right? They certainly are smart and they're motivated, but how can I make them more at ease and, if I have to put a word on it, more authentic in how they utilize and employ those gifts and talents? Then I think my company does a pretty good job at delivering those folks to me.
That's fascinating. The part about insecure type A's, I think, is, first of all, super true. Earlier in the day, I got out of a conversation with somebody who is absolutely smarter than me on every dimension. He didn't know it, and I hope I helped him to believe it. I don't know.
Yeah. And what I like about interacting with folks like that is, if you're smarter than me on every dimension and I can help you realize that, that doesn't diminish me at all. Makes me better, actually. So it's interesting how we think about these things, about intelligence and accomplishment and achievement. Yours on the plus side doesn't diminish mine on the minus side.
So there's a new question that I've just started asking people, which is, what does your job cost you?
That is a good question. And I'm going to preface everything that I say with, I like my job. I like the people that I work with. I like the things that we do. But I think my job cost me, and again, this gets back to the point that before I came to having a sort of a real job, I spent 7 years as a CEO and founder of a startup. And that level of, it's less about autonomy and more about, let's try things. What's the worst that could happen? The whole thing, falls to pieces and our investors lose a few $1,000,000. All right. Seems monumental at the time, but you've come to realize it's just not that big a deal. And so I think what it cost me is the ability to try things, to fail if they fail, not have to get 1,000 layers of permission to be able, or 1,000 cross-functional partners who all want to have their little piece in this. And there's reasons why that is. I'm not saying those are bad things in a large corporate environment, but it's just not where I thrive, I think. So I think I'm a little bit of an animal out of his natural habitat. So it costs me being an animal that is in his natural habitat. It's a pretty great habitat, don't get me wrong, and I'm doing just fine in it, but it's not my natural habitat. And I think that's what it costs me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now that I've been asking this question recently, I've been getting very different answers, and I can totally see that, which is that you're accustomed to being free range. Free range, in other words, lots of room to move, lots of room to make your own destiny. When I asked one person once what they hired their job to do for them, what they said to me was, I hire my job to eat only what I kill. And I was like, wow, I've never heard that one before.
That's good.
But what he meant was that he was placing a wager every day that he was going to be able to win his next business. And he liked the high stakes game that he was
Like
playing.
the hunt. Yeah, I get that. And look, I think that one of the things that this is probably a subject for a whole nother podcast, it is okay to hire our jobs to be able to earn a living, to put roofs over our heads and food on our table and shoes on our feet, so we can then be safe and secure to go off and do other stuff.
Yep, that's absolutely true.
I think that we've lost a little bit of that notion that the job is not the thing, the job is what gets me the things. And I think it's okay if you have a job and it gets you the things, pays the bills, and then I can have time and space to do other things. I think especially in the high-tech Silicon Valley world, That's sometimes not an okay thing to say, but I'm just here for the work, which is good and meaningful and interesting, and I want to do it well, but I'm really just here for the paycheck so I can go off and do other stuff. That's how most of humanity lived for most of the time. And so maybe getting back to that a little bit isn't such a bad thing.
Right. Work does not have to be religion. It doesn't have to be necessarily all-consuming.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's so funny because we've known each other in 3 different spaces.
At least 3 different phases of our lives.
I know. I knew the NextSpace building before you knew the NextSpace building, and then you moved into the NextSpace building, and then I worked at the NextSpace building, and then your kids were in my wife's school, and there's all sorts of just connections. As always, I learned a ton talking to you, and so thank you very much for your time today.
I'm delighted that you had me on, and I learned a ton getting to talk to you. So thanks for that as well.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.